What does Russia want from Africa? For many years, the Kremlin was content to let Wagner, Russia's best-known mercenary group, call the shots in countries like Mali. But now Wagner says it has pulled out of the Sahel nation. Its units there taken over by the Africa Corps, a paramilitary group overseen by Moscow's defense ministry. Analysts say up to 80% of the Africa Corps are former Wagner fighters. When asked about the withdrawal, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov gave a clear statement of Russia's ambitions in Africa.
The Russian presence in Africa is growing. We really intend to comprehensively develop our interaction with African countries, focusing primarily on economic and investment interaction. And this cooperation also extends to such sensitive areas as defense and security. In this regard, Russia will also continue to interact with African states.
So where has Russia and its paramilitary forces from Wagner and the Africa Corps already been active in Africa? Let's take a look. Wagner has been in the Central African Republic since 2018, protecting President Faustin Archange Touadéra. In November last year, they expanded their footprint to Equatorial Guinea, where they also provide security for the president. Wagner also had brief stints providing military and political security in Madagascar and Mozambique. And they've been reported as operational in Libya and Sudan. But it is in the alliance of Sahel states, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, that Russian influence is most profound and deepening. All three nations have recently experienced coups and broken off long-standing security ties with the U.S. and other Western powers. Mali, ruled by a junta that seized power in coups in 2020 and 2021, has never officially admitted Wagner's presence there, only saying it works with Russian instructors. But its military leaders and their supporters welcomed Russian support as they pushed for the withdrawal of French forces, the country's former colonial power. After 3.5 years in Mali, Wagner claims to have brought all regional capitals under the control of the Malian army and to have killed thousands of militants and their commanders. But is it really mission accomplished? Well, Wagner's withdrawal comes amid what the Malian army is calling a resurgence of jihadist attacks. This footage claims to show militants raiding a military base in Mali's Mopti region earlier this month. An al-Qaeda-linked group claims it was behind the attack. The incident, part of a wider pattern of escalating violence in the Sahel region. For more on all things Wagner and Mali, let's bring in Beverly Ochieng, analyst with the think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She joins us from Dakar, Senegal. Beverly, Moscow says the Wagner Group is leaving Mali because it's mission accomplished there. I put it to you, is the job done?
Not quite yet, because the insurgency in Mali has continued. We have seen continued attacks, particularly by the al-Qaeda group, as well as Islamic State, a spread of the militancy from just the north and central towards the west and the southern regions, which wasn't the case just before the Wagner group itself had arrived in the country. So right now it feels more as if Russia is trying to consolidate control over paramilitaries, because the Wagner group was seen as a counter force or as a sort of power struggle between what the Russian Defense Ministry wants to achieve in the region, while the Wagner Group was rather semi-autonomous, particularly after the death of its founder.
Again, there are credible reports that up to 80% of the Africa Corps, that Russian paramilitary force replacing Wagner, are former Wagner members themselves. Does this transition indicate genuine change in Moscow's approach, or is it simply a rebranding by Russia, an opportunity to distance from the Wagner name while maintaining influence in the region?
Yes, it does feel as if Russia wants to move away from some of Wagner's tactics, and part of it was concerns about operational command, concerns around human rights abuses, and even heavy-handed tactics while carrying out counterinsurgency operations. But the fact that it still is with members from that former paramilitary force, the Wagner Group, means that there will be a need for reorientation. There might be a need for thinking around what the strategy and visibility of the paramilitaries is in the region, because Malian authorities themselves have often repeatedly said they're not receiving support from what attempt to be mercenaries, but rather they're working with military instructors. So it might be a more formalized approach of security, but not so much a change of tactics or even in the successfulness of ground operations.
Let's talk about the Kremlin soft power, from education programs to cultural centers. The number of those Russian centers across the continent is still under 10. And with so much focus on political marketing and propaganda, I wonder how deep and authentic is Russia's soft power compared to its military footprint?
The sense of authenticity tends to come from the fact that it's being perpetuated by groups that are already in country, either speaking in the local languages or youth and activist groups that have some popularity, particularly in urban areas. So if they present a pro-Russian message, say in Bambara or in, the Songo language in the Central African Republic, it's seen as being authentic. But realistically speaking, the level of interaction with Russian propaganda is not as high, especially if you're looking at rural areas or areas where paramilitaries have been accused of carrying out rights abuses. So northern Mali being one example where rights groups are outspoken against alleged abuses by Russian paramilitaries. By contrast, in Bamako, for instance, you will find that key groups like Irewolo or the CDM will be perpetuating pro-Russian narratives and pro-military government narratives. Same thing in the CAR. The youth movement of the ruling party would hold pro-Russian rallies in Bangui at the height of the Ukraine insurgency, even right now, and in support with the government. This is different from rural populations that sometimes are subjected to heavy-handed tactics by the paramilitaries and by the army, according to most allegations.
As you know, Russia's economic clout is often described as limited when compared to China, for example, or the EU. Given its recent push for investment and trade, what real leverage does Moscow have over African economies?
Well, for the most part, in countries where it's operating, these are countries that have already limited their diplomatic and commercial choices. So in Mali, for instance, they're looking to Russia to be able to gain technical support in the mining sector. Geologists have been in the country trying to scope other areas where they could develop mineral or even energy sectors. In places like Burkina Faso, we know that Norgold has a significant stake in part of the mining sector. And Russia also does have inroads in other countries, not as a dominant player, but as one of the key players, but it's not among the leading developmental donors. A lot of it is still banked on soft power, and a lot of it is banked on geopolitical grandstanding rather than actual effectual changes to the economy or significant inputs to the economy. A lot is still hanging in the balance. They've signed MOUs, but we haven't seen those MOUs being implemented, whether it's in energy in the Sahel, whether it's in mining in the CAR. But a lot of it is because it's pushing out Western stakeholders, both diplomatic and commercial, and trying to use that as a leverage for these governments as an alternative given their own limited choices.
Beverly, you're getting me to another issue here. It's a critical issue that people talk about. Russia's security partnerships apparently often come with resource concessions, access to gold mines in the Central African Republic, for example, in exchange for boots on the ground. Talk to us about how the model works and how extractive it is in practice.
So over the time that the Wagner Group had been operating in the Central African Republic, they were able to go fighting against rebel groups that were overseeing areas with high mineral reserves. And because the Central African Republic had much poorer regulations around whether it's ownership of mines, whether it's controlling the concessions, the Wagner Group was able to capitalize on this and take de facto control of mining areas, but also expand its economic interest. So it wasn't just mining, it was timber, it was livestock. There was even vodka being offered, by contrast with, say, French beer or other French security and economic concessions in the country. They did attempt to replicate that, particularly in Mali, but without as much success. In fact, some of the entities that were established in Mali to possibly go into the mineral sector was sanctioned almost immediately by the West. And by contrast, again, Mali has very strong mining regulations. Russia hasn't quite been able to play a hand in the mineral sector, but they have pledged to help them build a refinery. They have pledged to train some of their technical staff and personnel. And in doing so, they would have an inroad in the sector, but Mali would still maintain a level of operational control. This would still work with being able to gain more revenue because ultimately the arrangement with paramilitaries is about payments. And whether it's through mineral concessions or certain other forms of direct revenue, particularly from countries that are highly dependent on the extractive industry, it would still enable Russia to be able to gain some sort of revenue from its security operations within the region.
To those who might say this is neocolonialism at work, plain and simple, or at least an attempt towards it, you say what?
I mean, if you look at the arguments being presented, particularly by pro-military government supporters in the Sahel, or even by the governments themselves, they see it as a win-win partnership. They see it as the non-paternalistic in the way that they related with the West or even with France, because they're doing it according to them on equal terms. They're able to have Russian commercial operators operating under very different mining codes, under very different regulatory environments, and under terms and conditions that they feel is favorable to them. For instance, Mali has been able to build its air force, which is something that had been a big handicap, particularly when they were being supported by, France and the UN. They've been able to purchase drones, for instance. They've been able to attain training for their military forces from the Russian paramilitaries as a result of their presence. So for them, it's a sovereign choice. But of course, it's almost no different from some of the relations that they did have with previous security partners who had different terms and conditions and expectations, especially on integrity, reputation, and human rights.
There are reports, of course, that Russia has a well-honed, innovative media operation that uses spin doctors to influence political discourse. How effective have these campaigns been in shaping African public opinion? Or is that just talk, really?
So it depends. So there's one thing about how digital media has really proliferated across the region as a result of the access to smartphones, but also the fact that there's civic education gaps on how media should be used and how that can be undermined, particularly by disinformation. Now, we know that the Africa Initiative, which is one of the sort of pro-Kremlin media entities that's operating in the region, they do have a presence in Burkina Faso, they have in the CAR, they're trying to establish presence in other West African states. They are training local journalists, presumably in fact-checking. They're training them to be able to tell their own stories. They're trying to build a sense of authenticity in narratives. But you will notice in some of those narratives, there's certain levels of denial, especially when it comes to issues around the Ukraine conflict, where there have been prominent political and activist voices who are supporting these military regimes that have spoken out against certain facts around the conflict. That is one. There's the fact that those governments have become less open to sharing information, particularly about security, and journalists are increasingly being trained against undermining security forces, and some of it is under the guise of things like the Africa Initiative. And because of those gaps around how to use digital information, then you find that disinformation, even that is being propagated by Russian trolls, ends up being the dominant narrative, particularly among urban youths. And we have seen, for instance, there's been this massive campaign in support of the Burkinabe military leader. Part of it is a result of his ideologies, which are representative of a majority of young people who feel they want to interrogate their relationship with the West. But a bit of it is also because of disinformation, because of a lack of transparency and clarity on the news coming out of Burkina Faso. So in the end, disinformation seems to be filling in the gap where we would be getting credible news accounts from mainstream sources.
As you well know, Mali is just one of the 3 military-led states in the Sahel, including Burkina Faso and Niger, that have turned squarely to Russia. What about nations just south in the Gulf of Guinea? How big a threat is Russia to the stability in this region and ultimately to sustain democracy there? Could Nigeria for example, be next?
I mean, for instance, we did see that there had been some protests in the northern part of Nigeria where Russian flags were being waved, and the questions about whether Russia had a hand in some of the anti-government protests. That felt opportunistic. But of course, those opportunistic patterns, which also began in the Sahel, are part of what drove Russia's entry into the region and some of its perceived popularity. Now, Russia itself is playing on both sides. One, it wants to extend its influence within the Western Africa region, all the way to the Gulf of Guinea. Lavrov was quite clear about that when he visited Mali about 2 years ago. At the same time, because of those divisions between Russia's paramilitary involvement in the Sahel and the risks of instability in the rest of the ECOWAS region, we're now seeing a real regional split. So the AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, emerging as a contrast, being supported by Russia to ECOWAS. And those geopolitical rifts are likely to heighten because the intra-country relations between the Sahel and some of those West African states is increasingly being undermined both by disinformation supported by Russian trolls, but also because of their contrasting relationships both with Russia and the West. There is a certain threat of stability, political stability, and trust between the governments. But of course, I think many countries are becoming more proactive in finding ways of still maintaining close cooperation with Russia that allows them to have an increase in diplomatic partners and finding pragmatic ways of engaging with the Sahel so that the instability there does not become a crisis for the future.
Beverly Ochieng from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I could talk to you far longer, but we'll have to stop it there. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you so much for having me as well.